Hey everyone, I hope you're enjoying Season of the Witch so far. Now that day 1 has passed and the damage meta has settled a little, I wanted to make a video addressing a frequently asked question by a lot of my viewers. A lot of the top rotations are class specific, so for example, if you're a Titan without access to Radiant Dance Machines, I wanted to make some specific recommendations for anyone wanting to do optimal DPS in any Fireteam boss scenario. Speaking of Titan, let's start with that. In order to execute all of the Titan rotations, you're going to need a few weapons. For exotics, you'll want Izanagi's Burden, Witherhoard, the Fourth Horseman, Tractor Cannon, and Gjallarhorn. As for legendaries, you'll want a 1-2 punch shotgun in both slots, preferably Wastelander and Xenoclast if you can get your hands on those. I'd also recommend getting a Trench Barrel Imperial Decree, specifically if you're on Gjallarhorn or Tractor. You'll also need a Swap GL if you're doing long range damage, so a Spike Grenade's Wilderflight is an ideal pick to have as well. Finally, Bequest or possibly Lament depending on the situation, as well as Apex Predator with Bait and Switch and possibly Surrounded if you want to be optimal on some bosses like Iryu. And no, Throne Cleaver isn't worth using for sword DPS, even with the double heavy slam, which eats your third heavy by the way, and enhanced Surrounded. As for abilities, you're most likely going to be on Berserker since Thunder Crash and Pulse Grenades combined are lower ability DPS than Banner of War builds, and every other Titan subclass is a lot worse for damage. Since your build is going to be focused primarily on melee damage components, Syntheseps are an obvious choice given how Banner of War plays out, with Armamentarium being a decent backup option for long range damage. Grenade-wise, I'd actually recommend Shackle for everything except the long range rotation in order to apply Suspend for Blade Fury. Why? Blade Fury's light attacks are the primary source of the super's damage, and being able to spam them instead of wasting super energy on the lower damage heavy attack in order to suspend is a much more effective way of using the super. On top of that, you get to fully utilize the benefit of the Fury part of the super, where you can spam light attacks faster if you use them consecutively. Grapple melees are also something to consider, but I'd say that these are situational enough that you shouldn't default to them over focusing on wailing away at the boss the second the phase starts. In order to optimize Berserker damage, you're also going to want a specific set of aspects and fragments. For aspects, you'll want Into the Fray to maximize Frenzied Blade melee uptime, and of course Banner of War to increase your melee damage by 40%. Fragments are a little more flexible, but I chose the classic Ascend Generation Duo for rocket reloads, as well as Continuity for extended suspend duration, and Warding for woven uptime outside of your super cast. Every subclass damage build has a base concept behind it, and Berserker Titan is no exception. Every solid Berserker rotation needs to keep a few things in mind. First, you'll want Woven Mail as often as possible, since the highest DPS component of your rotation, your Frenzied Blade melee, relies on Into the Fray in order to be available as often as possible. Second, using one 1-2 punch shot to buff 2 melees is higher DPS than just one, so you're going to want to prioritize burning 2 melees, then allowing one to recharge so you can burn 2 at once again. On top of this, Frenzied Blade charges faster from 1 to 2 charges compared to 0 to 1, so that's another good reason to save a melee instead of using 3 in a row. Let's talk about actual rotations now. I've split these into 5 categories which I think pretty much cover almost every boss scenario in the game. First up, we have swords, which have become a recent topic of debate thanks to the most recent raid reprise, Crota's End. According to preliminary testing, Crota takes 25 to 35% more sword damage, which has made them the premier choice for damage on this boss, especially given that rockets, the typical go-to, do around 20% less damage to Crota compared to a normal weapon. For Titan, I'd recommend 2 swords, the same as any other class, Surrounded Bequest if you can consistently proc Surrounded, with Lament being the runner-up if you're just going for a consistent and easy damage option. As for your combo, 1 heavy, 2 light is ideal for Bequest, assuming you have Swordmasters and Lucent Blades, with 2 light, 1 heavy, 1 regular being the best combo for Lament under the same conditions. If you're interested in incorporating something like the Fourth Horseman or your melees into a sword rotation, I have a video on how to do an optimized Berserker Horseman Bequest rotation in my DPS spreadsheets ranking tab. Our next 2 rotation categories are actually quite similar. They force you onto a suboptimal DPS exotic heavy in order to support your team by amplifying their damage. First, we have debuff, and second, we have Gjally. The 2 rotations I'm going to recommend to Titan players are actually identical for both these roles. If you're on Tractor, I'd throw in the Imperial Decree I mentioned before, as well as an Energy 1-2 punch shotgun. The rotation itself is pretty easy. Just Tractor, 1-2 punch 2 melees, dump 2 trench procs, and repeat. Then whenever you fully run out of melees, suspend, Tractor, and cast your super, then just start over from square one. Remember that trench barrel and reload cancelling are the ideal way to play if you're using an aggressive shotgun like Imperial Decree. Finally, our mainstream damage rotations, which I've split into long and short range bosses. For long range bosses, you're probably not using your melees or Blade Fury, so you're going to be forced to use Berserker essentially like an empty subclass with occasional Thread of Ascent reloads for your rocket. That means doing the standard Izzy GL rocket nade rocket on repeat until you run out of rockets. As for short range bosses, I've actually developed a special rotation that uses a surrounded apex because if you're on Berserker, the assumption is that you have nearby enemies to proc Biotic off to begin with. The rotation itself is a little complicated, but it follows the rules of using 2 melees, then filling the time of your second charge while using weapons, then using your super to reset the cycle and start over. If you want to see the exact order of inputs and weapons, this rotation is also featured in the Spreadsheets ranking tab under the name Berserker Apex. Since it's entirely possible in an LFG run that you run out of rockets or your main damage source is ammo, I've also decided to briefly mention some post-dump damage options on Titan. Since you have Into the Fray and likely a decent amount of energy ammo to spare, I would suggest scavenging for orbs, swapping to Merciless, and using it in between melee charges with a kinetic 1-2 punch shotgun. Next on the list we have Hunter. Hunters have the widest spread of equipment options when it comes to damage, so let's tackle weapons first. For exotics, you'll recognize some familiar names: Izanagi's Burden, the 4th Horseman, Tractor Cannon, and Gjallarhorn. On the other hand, legendaries are a bit more unique. You'll want aggressive swap shotguns in both slots, like Ragnhild D plus Mindbender's Ambition, or the Comedian with a 15% damage perk, like Vorpal or Frenzy. For your Izzy swaps, you're always going to want an Energy Sniper or a GL, preferably a Firing Line Distant Tumulus and Spike Frenzy Wilderflight. As for swords, you'll be taking the usual Surrounded Bequest or Lament, with a bait and switch Apex Predator as the default rocket pick with maybe a surrounded roll on top for certain bosses. If you have a god roll Cold Comfort, Hunter is also the only class where I'd recommend bringing it with you to damage in case you can use multi-dodge. Armor-wise, Hunters have a lot of options. By default, you'll likely be on Star Eater scales, swapping mid damage to something like the Dragon Shadow for 1-2-3 swaps, Radiant Dance Machines for rocket dumping, Foetracer for 4-2 surge stacking, and Knucklehead Radar for final stands. There's also a chance a rotation favors Nighthawk over Blade Barrage, so keep that in your back pocket as well. Let's talk supers. Most players are familiar with the dominance of Feast of Light Blade Barrage, but I'd like to recommend 2 alternatives. Since weapon damage in every Hunter rotation eventually surpasses super damage, if you'd be better served using Foetracer and Monochromatic Maestro to boost your weapon damage at the cost of using Blade Barrage, sometimes it can be worth that trade. For example, if you're doing sword damage on Bequest, you may want to consider using Gathering Storm and then taking advantage of Foetracer and Mono as mentioned. Additionally, if a boss is incompatible with Blade Barrage, or your weapons are better suited to a Kinetic Surge's benefits, then Nighthawk swapping is also a good backup plan that we'll discuss in the next section. For your grenades, I take either Healing for a quick Benevolence proc or Fusion for a fast charging Scorch Source for monochromatic and singeing procs. Melees are pretty straightforward as well. If you're prioritizing burst and don't need your dodge often, Lightweight is a good idea thanks to its short animation. If you need your dodges more often, then Knife Trick is a solid option thanks to its double duty Scorch and Radiant applications. Finally, for your dodge, I'd recommend Gamblers for Dragon's Shadow rotations, since it also recharges your knife while taking about the same time as Marksman's dodge, with Marksman being the default straightforward option for everything else. As for your aspects and fragments, it's a pretty straightforward affair. Knock 'em down increases Blade Barrage projectile count, so that's a no-brainer. On Your Mark also increases handling on dodge, which makes Hunter rotations feel a lot snappier no matter what weapon you're using. Gunpowder doesn't really provide to damage rotations besides maybe a small amount of free damage if pre-thrown, but you're probably better off using the other 2 aspects for most situations. For fragments, I have Benevolence for ability regen, Solace for radiant duration, Torches for proccing Benevolence off melees, Singeing for dodge regen, and Ashes as a throwaway 5th fragment. In previous streams, you may have heard me recommend Gold Tusk for Hunter sword damage. However, as a result of some additional testing and value adjustment, Gold Tusk has fallen by the wayside even on bosses where its aerial light heavy animation cancel combo is usable, which is a rare situation to begin with. As a result, I'd like to formally recommend the exact same setup as Titan for sorting a boss on Hunter, Surrounded Bequest if you can get it procced, otherwise just use Lament with the same combos mentioned before in the Titan section. Once again, 1 or 2 Hunters can use Gathering Storm with a Foetracer swap in order to fully take advantage of Monochromatic Maestro, especially when involving Horsemen somewhere in your damage as well. Remember to cap your frames and have loosened blades on, and you should be set for sword DPS. As for debuff and Gjally, the 2 rotations presented here are going to be a little different than what you're probably used to. If you're on Tractor, I'd start on Star Eater Scales Blade Barrage and swap to the Dragon's Shadow, but with a twist. Instead of the typical marksman's dodge used in most hunter rotations, we're gonna go with gamblers, relying on both benevolence and singeing to regen our longer dodge cooldown by the time we need it again, while also getting our melee back. The rotation itself is fairly simple, it's called 1-2-3 swapping for a reason. Ragnold, Comedian, Tractor, 1-2-3 in that order, on repeat, dodging and knifing whenever you empty a shotgun completely. Throw a Blade Barrage in right after you start with a Tractor shot and you're pretty much set from there. Gjallarhorn's rotation is practically the same, just substitute the Comedian for Mindbenders, watch your distance, and the rotation should stick. Finally, we've got our normal rotations. For long range, I'm going to recommend an Izzy Sniper Apex rotation with a swap from Nighthawk to Foetracer. If you've done Trio Garden before, you might be familiar with the Dragon Shadow rotation used on Harpy. This is almost identical DPS, only with higher total damage and a lower mechanical skill requirement. Simply pop on Nighthawk, swap to Foetracer, then do Izzy, 2-Sniper, Rocket on repeat, shooting twice for the first cycle and knifing and dodging whenever you have it up. Your super should trigger Foetracer's effect first, and every subsequent knife will continue to keep your Solar Surge uptime permanent. For short range bosses, of course I have to recommend Radiant Dance Machines. Match your surge to either Cold Comfort or Apex Predator, then I do the following: Izzy, Blade Barrage immediately on Star Eater, swap to Radiant Dance Machines mid-animation, GL, then Rocket Spam. As for what to do after you're done dumping rockets, you can always swap to Merciless or Horseman and make good use of your remaining energy ammo that way. And of course, if you're on Hunter and you only have primary ammo left, Lucky Pants enables the Malfeasance option as well as a Vorpal Warden's Law if that suits your fancy. Don't forget to use Knucklehead Radar for final stance with downtime. Last but not least, we have Warlock. Compared to the other two classes, Warlocks actually have the shortest list of required weapons for damage. For exotics, the classic 4, Izzy, Horseman, Tractor, and Gjally. Legendary shouldn't be a surprise either, the same aggressive pellets as Hunter, the same swap energy GL requirements, Bequest, Lament, and situational apexes. To wrap things up, Warlock damage exotics include Necrotic Grip for a slight DOT for Broodweaver damage, Ophidian Aspect for a great general neutral pick, Getaway Artist in case you're on Stormcaller to proc mono on long Bequest phases, and Rain of Fire for Icarus Dash reload support on Gjally and Tractor rotations. Don't forget that if you're on Well of Radiance, you can place your Well on Lunafaction boots and swap to a better damaged exotic like Rain of Fire while still keeping the range and reload buffs that a Lunafaction Well would give you. Given the exotics we've just discussed, it probably comes as no surprise that Broodweaver and Dawnblade are my two subclass picks for Warlock DPS. If you're not the Well Warlock and you're not on Gjally or Tractor, then Broodweaver should be your default pick with its excellent Thread of Ascent support, solid damage super in Needlestorm, and Threadling generation potential. Otherwise, of course, Well of Radiance is a must for damage, and Icarus Dash being one of the fastest reload methods in the game with Rain of Fire is an invaluable asset to have when you have to reload 3 slow loading weapons. As for your grenades, I'd pretty much always be on Grapple on Warlock since the other two grenades pale in damage comparisons and take far longer to recharge. On Solar, Touch of Flame fusions are a good idea if you don't need Double Dash on Rain of Fire, especially if you plan on implementing a grenade exotic like Verity's Brow into your damage rotation. Besides that, I've chosen Weaver's Call and Mindspun Invocation on Broodweaver in order to obtain 4 fragments while being able to generate some Purge Threadlings before damage start. Weavewalk is a potential option if for whatever reason you're on Gjally but not on Dawnblade, but it's a secondary consideration and not my first choice. Finally, everyone should recognize the 4 strand fragments in play as well: Ascent for rocket loading, Generation for faster ascent returns, Continuity for unravel assistance, and Evolution for additional Needlestorm and other Threadling damage. Finally, let's finish this video with my top picks for Warlock DPS options. First, let's start by explaining the concept behind these rotations, much like we did with the other two classes. On Broodweaver, your job is to balance Thread of Ascent's 4-second internal cooldown with your other timers during damage, including Reconstruction's 3.5-second loading time and other factors like your Needlestorm duration. On top of this, finding the right time to weave in an Arcane Needle is also a good idea in order to apply Unravel and possibly some Necrotic Ticks. With that out of the way, let's talk about the rotations themselves. As I mentioned before, on a boss like Crota where you might be using Bequest for damage, you don't really need more than 2 wells off contest, so it makes sense to consider Stormcaller, since Arc Souls are a decent way to get some passive damage added to the whole team while proccing mono for Bequest and possibly Horseman. Otherwise, Well and Lament are a tried and true combo worth your time if consistency is what you care about. Same combos as the Titan section assuming you have Loosened Blades. If you're on debuff or Gjally duty, your job here is surprisingly simple on Warlock. Since Rain of Fire is a fast, no questions asked, all weapons reload every 4 seconds or so, you don't need to go through the effort hunters need to in order to load all your weapons on something like a double pellet Gjally rotation. No benevolence or singeing procs, just plain old 1-2-3 swaps for both Tractor and Gjally using 2 aggressives and your trusty power exotic. To put things explicitly, shoot weapon 1, shoot weapon 2, then weapon 3, then repeat, only dashing whenever one of those 3 weapons is empty. For the lazy ones watching, you're in luck. The Warlock long range and short range rotations for general use are actually the exact same. Normally in D2, weapons like shotguns trade range for high damage potential, but the Izzy GL Apex rotation that I recommend for long range actually does more damage than Duality Slug Apex, so go figure I guess. As for how you do it, the fine details are available in my spreadsheet clips, but the basic idea is just spamming Izzy GL Rocket Grapple Rocket over and over, with one tight grapple timing after using your Needle Storm in order to use Threat of Ascent and Reconstruction within the same second to load 2 rockets. Since the Izzy GL Apex rotation leans heavily on dumping your first and third weapon slots ammo, the natural decision for what to do after you run out of ammo is pretty simple. Swap to Merciless and go to town. And that's it for all 3 classes. The Titan stuff can be a little situational, but it's the best we've got as of now. At worst, Titan is basically Warlock without a good unconditional DPS super and Unravel source, and at best, it does some pretty great damage without using almost any ammo. One more thing, my most recent video goes over an experimental new sword DPS option for debuff players using Heart Shadow and an aggressive shotgun. And while it's relatively new, current evidence compels me to recommend that you try it out, especially if you're on Tractor in a supportive ammo generating team. While it doesn't absolutely dominate other sword options, it's much more consistent tracking wise and absolutely demolishes anything else you could do on Tractor Cannon for sword bosses. Hopefully this video answered those of you looking for concrete damage options for all of your DPS needs this season, and I'll be sure to keep you guys posted if anything significant changes in the meta from now until next season. For now, this is going to be it for me and DPS videos, but I'm looking forward to my next set of videos where I'll analyze every special and power weapon type in the game, tiering and explaining how they're used and what roles to look out for. See you then.